This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. On May 18, 1985, 23-year-old Shiva Tripathi of the village of Dibyapur in northern India died under suspicious circumstances. She was married to a man named Chetty Lal, and together they had 2 sons, ages 18 months and 6 months. According to custom in India, after the wedding, Shiva moved in with her husband and his parents. This meant that Shiva, who grew up in a city, would have to adjust to a more rural lifestyle. The Tripathis were members of the highest caste, or fixed social group in India, the Brahmins. This meant that Shiva was able to attend school, learn to read and write, have a job, etc. But it didn't prevent her from an arranged marriage when she was 16. It also didn't prevent her from basically being a hostage in her own home, needing permission from her father-in-law to simply leave the house. Shiva grew up in the city of Etawah in the state of Uttar Pradesh in northern India. Etawah is only about 50 miles from Dibyapur, where her husband grew up and where Shiva would relocate after her marriage. But the differences between the two places were stark and disorienting to Shiva. The transition from city life to village life was difficult, not only for Shiva, but for her in-laws especially. They quickly grew to resent Shiva and her urban manners, and went out of their way to make her time in Dibyapur miserable. The resentments only intensified when Shiva briefly returned to Etawah to complete her exams necessary for her college degree, an educational distinction not held by her sisters-in-law. Her oldest sister-in-law took particular exception to this development. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to The Death and Life of Shiva Tripathi. On May 18, 1985, Shiva was invited back to Etawah for a family wedding. At the time, her husband was out of town on business, and Shiva would have had to travel the 4 hours by train unattended, something she had done many times before. Shiva's father-in-law, yielding to months of simmering resentment, forbid the journey. In fact, he grew so upset that he contacted Shiva's father, a man named Ramsiya Tripathi, to see if he would consider breaking the marriage arrangement and taking his daughter back. This offer was refused, as Ramsiya was a traditionalist and believed that things would get smoothed over. He also understood his daughter's place in the home and didn't interfere with the decision to prevent her from attending the wedding. But it would seem that Shiva wasn't happy about it. Her uncle had coincidentally been visiting Dibyapur on the evening of the 18th and stopped by to see Shiva. The uncle testified that Shiva had recently been beaten by her mother-in-law and sister-in-law for her insistence that she be allowed to attend the family event. The uncle sympathized with her misfortune, reassured her that everything would be okay, and left for the evening. The next morning, Shiva Tripathi's body would be found, lying in between the tracks of a nearby railroad station. Her in-laws claimed that she had been suicidal, and that she had flung herself in front of an oncoming train. Now, despite the fact that she hadn't mentioned any type of despondency to her father, uncle, or siblings, and that witness reports that her body only had any visible trauma on the back of her head, still, local authorities agreed with the suicide story and, at her father-in-law's request, moved quickly to declare the case closed and cremate the body that morning. Her uncle had heard about the discovery of the body and witnessed the complete lack of trauma anywhere except Shiva's head. The uncle pleaded with the authorities to wait and do a more thorough investigation before they lit the cremation fire, but they dismissed him and proceeded before her father could even arrive and say his goodbyes. Wouldn't there be more significant damage to a body that was struck by an oncoming train? Why didn't the local authorities investigate further? Could it be attributed to systemic misogyny in India that the death of a woman requires no additional investigation beyond what the man responsible tells them? Was her father-in-law friendly with the police and maybe called in a favor to protect his own daughter, the person Shiva's father believes to be responsible for the murder of his daughter? This girl, he claimed, bashed the back of Shiva's head in with a brick. Ramsiya, understandably destroyed by the loss of his daughter, the suspicious circumstances, and her speedy, nearly unprecedented cremation, wasn't about to let things go. He demanded a formal inquest into Shiva's death and saw Shiva's husband and father-in-law arrested. After extensive questioning, the men were released, but a warrant for the arrest of the mother-in-law and sister-in-law was issued. But they had already fled the province. When they were found and detained for questioning, it wasn't long before they were released for lack of evidence. After all, the body was reduced to ash within hours of her death. Ramsiya was left to grieve his daughter and live with the sorrow of never seeing her again. Or would he? 2 months after the death of Shiva Tripathi, in the remote village of Sharifpura, some 60 miles away from Dibyapur, another young mother named Sumitra Singh died following a violent seizure. Sumitra, just like Shiva, was living with her husband and in-laws at the time of her death. Sumitra was 17 and had been married for 4 years and had 1 child. The seizure that struck young Sumitra was sudden and devastating, made all the worse by the conditions of the village she lived in. The Singh family were of a lower caste than the Tripathis. They were Thakurs of the warrior caste, poorer than Brahmins and usually farmers and traders. The village where Sumitra lived had no electricity or running water. There was a well in the village that everyone used. The caste system is an accepted social structure across India. Although it is losing influence in the major cities, it's still extremely prevalent in the small villages across the country. Your caste is assigned to you at birth based on your family's caste, and it's permanent. So when someone in a poorer caste who lives in a village lacking modern technology and medical facilities, an otherwise treatable malady could be life-threatening. When Sumitra's convulsions stopped, her heart stopped as well. Her breathing slowly abated as the color drained from her face. Her husband ran to fetch the village healer, but this guy had no idea what was going on and basically was just there to confirm that Sumitra had died, which he did. Sumitra's father was told there was no hope for his daughter and that grieving should begin immediately. But then something unexpected happened. Sumitra woke up, but it wasn't quite Sumitra. In India, the concept of reincarnation is widely accepted, as is the idea of possession. Possession doesn't always mean the demonic kind that we talk about here so often, the Catholic kind of possession. The word generally means that a person has changed to the point that people familiar with the person no longer recognize their personality. Maybe they answer to a different name, or they claim not to recognize people they've known their entire lives, or have memories different from what they have personally experienced. In the West, these conditions go by several different diagnoses: multiple personality disorder, schizophrenia, hysteria, possession syndrome, etc. However, in India, for a specific type of possession, they have a specific Hindi word, parakaya pravesh. It translates to, quote, entering into another body. When these cases are alleged, they are meticulously studied in order to find evidence of knowledge acquired by paranormal means. Seriously. And out of innumerable investigations, a rare few have actually been declared to have met that standard. Knowledge acquired by paranormal means. So, back to the small village and recently deceased Sumitra Singh. The only issue with that statement is that she didn't stay deceased for long. Real quick about Sumitra. Given her caste status and her father's near constant search for consistent employment, she moved a lot as a child and spent several years with extended family away from her parents. She was married off at 13, a mother at 16, and by early 1985 had begun to experience mysterious health problems that included blacking out, trance-like states that could last for days, eyes rolling back in her head, and nothing seemed to work to get her better, at least as far as the village healer was concerned. He told them that these were instances of possession, and Sumitra should be asked if she had developed memories that were not her own. She insisted she had no such memories. Then, on July 16, 1985, Sumitra announced that she would die 3 days later, which she did. When she woke up, or reanimated, it was to the utter shock of everyone in the village. But even more shocking, maybe not more shocking than a resurrection, but slightly less shocking, was the fact that Sumitra Singh had no idea who Sumitra Singh was, and insisted to everyone that she be called Shiva. She didn't recognize her husband, she rejected her child, she laughed when her father told her who he was. She demanded to be returned to a village called Dibyapur and reunited with her children, despite the fact that, get this, she had been murdered not too long ago by her own sister-in-law. All right, let's take a minute to point out a few key facts here. The first is that no one in her family, or in her entire village for that matter, had any idea what the hell she was talking about. Remember, there was no electricity, not just in her home, but in the village. No phones, no radio, no TV, and they hardly ever received newspapers because the majority of the people in the community couldn't read. How could Sumitra have known about the alleged murder of a girl who lived hours away by train, a girl who had never been to Sharifpura, a girl who belonged to a different caste? And the same could be said for Sumitra. Since her marriage, she hadn't left Sharifpura. She had never been to Dibyapur. She had no way of knowing anything at all about Shiva Tripathi. Now suddenly she seemed to know everything about her, including who murdered her and how. The incredibly frustrating thing about all of this was that no one could have possibly understood how exactly right she was about everything she was saying about Shiva, because no one else in the village had met her either. For days, everyone thought she had simply lost her mind or was suffering some after effects from her near-death experience. But when she insisted that everyone call her Shiva, and that she had no idea who this Sumitra person was, she was taking things a little too far. Communications being what they were in rural India at the time, it was more than a month before Shiva's father, Ramsai Tripathi, heard a rumor that his deceased daughter had taken possession of a girl in a remote village. We can imagine his shock at hearing this completely accidentally as he was on an unannounced trip to Dibyapur. But it still took an additional 2 months before he could persuade an acquaintance from still another village, but much closer to Sharifpura, to go and investigate these claims. It didn't take long for this person to verify that indeed, a young mother, previously known as Sumitra Singh, was now insisting that she was Shiva Tripathi, recently murdered and now in possession of the body of this poor villager. When Ramsiya heard this news, he arranged to visit Sharifpur immediately. Like everyone in India, Ramsiya was aware of people claiming to be possessed, aware of reincarnation, and other supernatural claims. He also knew that these claims were never verified, and usually were made by grifters looking to profit off the grief of surviving loved ones. To possibly avoid this end, Ramsiya made sure his visit was kept secret. He wanted to surprise this girl and test her story, and he arrived with what he believed would put an end to all this possession nonsense: a family photo album If his daughter really had taken possession of this girl, well, then she should be able to recognize photos of her family and correctly name everybody in them. When Ramsiya arrived at the Singh residence, Sumitra joyfully exclaimed, "Papa!" and broke down weeping. Ramsiya wept as well, for this was the name all his children called him. Yes, it was a common nickname for fathers in India, but still, it was unnerving. When Ramsiya produced the photo album, Sumitra's eyes lit up. She couldn't wait to dig in. To Ramsiya's complete bewilderment, the girl correctly identified every single person in the album. And the photos were from 18 years prior, nothing recent. She identified siblings, cousins, aunts and uncles, everyone. Sumitra's father also let Ramsiya know that Sumitra had undergone dramatic changes in lifestyle, speech, manner of dress, everything that corresponds to a person of a higher caste. And incredibly, she could suddenly read and write fluently. Whereas before the seizure, she had, at best, the reading and writing skills of a kindergartner. Ramsiya had no other choice than to take this girl, this stranger, back to Etawah and see if she could maintain her incredible show of intimate knowledge of the Tripathi family. And he had arranged for more tests. Upon arrival at his home in Etawah, he had arranged for a group of 5 women to greet them and told Sumitra that one of those women was Shiva's mother. Could she pick her out? "My mother is not among those women," was the reply. And damn it, she was right. This was one of Ramsiya's tricks. Then, without asking permission, as if she had lived there her entire life, Sumitra ran into the family home, immediately found her mother, and pulled her into an embrace. For the next few hours, they went through more family photo albums, and she recognized everyone, until she suddenly stopped at one particular picture. She stared at it with rage in her eyes. "That's my sister-in-law," she said. "She's the one who hit me on the back of the head with a brick." There were other extraordinary moments. One example involves a distant cousin who, since Shiva had last seen him, had grown a beard, a big bushy beard that made him unrecognizable. When he was put in front of Sumitra in person, she couldn't place who he was. Ramsiya was about to throw around accusations of fraud when the cousin asked a question and Sumitra instantly recognized his voice and named him correctly. Sumitra, still insisting on being called Shiva, eventually returned to her home village, her husband, her child. But she never went back to being Sumitra. And her incredible story is one of the handful that are actually considered to include unexplainable, paranormal means of obtaining knowledge. Look, investigators spent years studying this case, and their conclusions are pretty remarkable. When considering Sumitra's life after the seizure, her comments and actions could be placed into 3 separate groups. This is according to the most comprehensive study of the case. The first group concerns information that was published either in newspapers or in the lawsuits brought by Shiva's father after her death. All of that information, although extremely unlikely, could have found a way to Sumitra in the days and weeks before her, quote, death and subsequent transformation into Shiva. Due to this fact, those statements were ignored. The second group are what were considered unverifiable statements, especially statements made concerning the alleged murder of Shiva, the arguments she had with her in-laws, the insistence that Shiva wasn't suicidal. These statements, although not contested in any official record, still can never be independently verified and were therefore ignored as well. It's the third group that gets really weird. This is the group of evidence that's made up by statements made by Shiva that she could not have obtained in a normal fashion. Personal items that were kept in secret places in the house, favored articles of clothing that Shiva never told anyone about, the birth order of her maternal uncles, including a guy that looked much older than he was. Sumitra still got the order correct. She knew the nicknames of Shiva's children, as well as her own nicknames. In all, it was determined that Sumitra had 19 pieces of knowledge that she had no way of knowing, at least not in the normal way. The only conclusion investigators were left with was that she obtained this knowledge in a non-normal way, or, yeah, I have to say it again, in a paranormal way. And believe me, I read extensively on this case, and these statements and family recognitions were legit. She wasn't asked leading questions or given nonverbal cues as to who the person was. None of those, carny tricks. These were either spontaneous recognitions, like someone walks into a room and she goes, "Hey, Johnny," or confrontational recognitions, where a person would walk right up to her unannounced and say, "Who am I? You should know me. Tell me my name." She always got it right. And beyond that, she would add another layer of intimate knowledge, like the person's nickname or a shared experience that no one else would have been able to know about. So it breaks down this way. There are 4 possible explanations for Sumitra's condition. 1. Fraud. She and her father fooled everyone with an elaborate hoax, months in the making. But that seems like a crazy proposition given the girl's illiteracy and inability to travel. Number 2, there's a thing called cryptoamnesia, where a person actually receives, in a normal way, specific information, but is unaware of it. They actually believe that they're a new person because they have no recollection of receiving the new information. It's like you would just wake up with new memories of an entirely different life. They construct an alternate identity with this information. But this falls apart pretty quickly when you think about it. Just being told people's names doesn't magically allow you to recognize them in 20-year-old photographs. Besides, all the information Sumitra had would have been impossible to get without someone in her family knowing about it. The third possibility is multiple personality disorder accompanied by paranormal knowledge. This one seems super complicated, but basically the theory states that Sumitra actually possessed psychic ability and gathered tons of information about Shiva, then constructed this personality after she learned Shiva had died, also telepathically. And number 4 is possession. Pretty cut and dry, and believe it or not, this is where the investigators landed. The recently deceased spirit of Shiva Tripathi found its way into the body of Sumitra Singh and took over, I guess forever. Hey, I admit, this one is pretty wild, and none of the proposed explanations make a lick of sense to me. None of them. What do you think? Thanks for listening. Make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You could also check out our socials at Devil Within Pod on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is a Cloud 10 Media production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan. Executive produced by Sim Sarna. Our post-production supervisor is Bruce Whitkin, who also provided original music for this episode. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.